Well, hello everybody. Today we're going to be looking at a very special ship, the destroyer escort USS Slater, which can be found in Albany in New York State. And I visited her back in September of 2024, but she is just about to open up for her 2025 season because it does get a bit chilly up there. And so this video is to show you some of what you can see aboard her and hopefully encourage you to have a visit yourself. And we're also going to see something rather special that you pretty much will never see on any other museum ship, I'm pretty sure. But before we climb aboard, we're going to go on a little boat tour around the ship, as they actually have one of their ship's boats fully functional. And as you can just about hear in the background, it has a very smooth running engine as well. So we'll take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the ship's history. As a Cannon-class destroyer escort, she was laid down in March 1943, launched just a little bit under a year later in February 1944, and commissioned a few months after that in May of the same year. She was named for Frank Slater, a US Navy sailor who'd relatively recently at that point been killed in action aboard the USS San Francisco during Admiral Callahan's night action off Guadalcanal. And once she entered service, she actually had an immediate direct connection to another vessel that is also preserved in the northern part of the USA, that being the German submarine U-505, as she was one of the ships that helped to transfer material from U-505 to the US for analysis. Now, being a destroyer escort, you'd think that she'd serve in the Pacific, which is where, let's face it, most of the US Navy ships served, but actually Slater was one of a number of US Navy destroyer escorts, as well as destroyers, escort carriers and the like, that actually served on Atlantic convoy duty. So in Slater's case, that meant from October 1944 through to May 1945, she could be found heading back and forth across the Atlantic, keeping convoys safe from torpedoes, as well as serving as a training ship in between convoy missions for new up-and-coming sailors to learn how to operate radar, sonar, and the various other anti-submarine warfare systems that were then the cutting edge. However, with her last convoy trip near enough coinciding with the end of the war in Europe, she was then sent over to the Pacific, but with the distances involved, she only actually made it to Pearl Harbor around about the time that Japan was officially giving up. So while Slater didn't see any combat actions in the Pacific, she would go on to see a fair bit of service during 1945, both escorting other ships around, just in case, and conducting missions of her own in the immediate post-war environment. But then, in common with most ships in the US Navy at that point, she was slated for deactivation. That would happen in 1947, and that's where Slater's career could have ended, with time spent in the reserve fleet followed by being scrapped. However, a few years later, she was transferred to the Hellenic Navy and renamed Atos, or Eagle, and thus survived in active service during the time period when the vast majority of destroyer escorts were scrapped. In fact, she didn't leave Greek service until 1991, at which point destroyer escort veterans managed to raise enough money to have her brought back to the US as a museum ship, and after spending some years down in New York City next to USS Intrepid undergoing the first stage of essentially unmodernizing the ship back to her World War II state, she moved up to Albany in 1997, where she's been ever since, and where the museum has gradually been working on restoring her back to her World War II condition. And so with that said, let's begin.
Right everyone, welcome aboard USS Slater, the Cannon-class destroyer escort here in Albany, right next to the bridge and the freeway, so apologies if there's any traffic noise. Now, as is traditional, we are starting at the bow of the ship, and of course, as is also traditional at this point, especially with the smaller ships, there is a comment or two to make about the freeboard when whoever's decided to burn half an oil field goes past. Now, the slope up to the bow here, so establishing the forward freeboard for seakeeping, is relatively steep. It's not as steep as some. You would have seen, I think, the Forrest Shermans probably win that particular competition as far as museum ships we've been on so far. But to give you some kind of reference, obviously we are right up here on the bow. There's quite a long drop down there, but as we're going to spin the camera around in a second, I'm looking at the two forward 3-inch guns as well as three twin 20mm Oerlikons, and there's also a Hedgehog launcher behind the first 3-inch gun, but at the moment my head height is actually above the height of the entire forward 3-inch gun and is approximately level with the barrel rest and choke on the Superfiring 3-inch gun. So that gives you some idea of just how quick the bow slopes up from the main freeboard of the ship. And of course, that's quite necessary because this is a destroyer escort. She's a relatively small vessel, but she has to escort convoys and so forth in the Atlantic and obviously later on the Pacific, and the destroyer escorts later go on to actually escort fleet elements as well. And so she really needs a nice high bow for seakeeping because, well, like most warships, she cannot really choose which part of the sea she's facing. But unlike other warships, which, although of course they do have to go where orders and operations tell them to go, with a destroyer escort, not only do they have to sail in that direction, but they may have to change course quite radically at any given point to go after U-boats or Japanese submarines or whatever, which means that even in really bad weather, where a fleet might choose to make a slight course deviation to keep their ride a little bit easier, destroyer escorts, if there's a sub out there, they don't have that luxury. They have to go where the threat is immediately. And so the last thing you want to do is bury your bow green, and that'll slow you down, potentially make you a target, could overwhelm some of your weapon systems. But also, as we'll see in a minute, the whole of the structure of the bow is designed that even if this rather nice forepeak here does go down in the water, the ship should be able to retain its capability to fight even when there's half the Atlantic coming down here. So let's see what I mean. So this is just literally turning around 180 degrees. Here's our forward 3-inch gun. Now, hopefully what you can see just about is just how high this breakwater is. Now, if you go on, say, HMS Belfast in London or any number of other museum ships, they'll generally have breakwaters on the bow, and of course that is to stop and deflect water that's come over the bow when you're taking it green. But even on a big 10,000 tonner like Belfast, the breakwater is actually considerably lower than the one that I'm standing behind. As you can see, this is almost waist height up front. And if I was to go slightly further back here, it actually becomes waist height and then becomes just slightly more than that. But the other thing you'll notice about this breakwater as opposed to the breakwater on a lot of other ships is most breakwaters will just run straight out to the side. So they're mainly about sluicing the water over the side. On this ship, the breakwater is almost entirely about keeping this open mount 3-inch gun operational because, well, if you're hunting a sub, you need this thing to stay active at pretty much any time that you can possibly help. And so rather than going completely side to side, this breakwater, whilst being somewhat higher, actually has passage down either side because it's just concentrating on keeping, let's say, the gun dry. And again, unlike many breakwaters, which will come out at a relatively shallow angle for that, this comes out and then it curves back. And from about roughly here, it actually just continues straight backwards. So it's no longer breaking water coming down, it's just keeping that water from flooding in onto your gunnery positions. Now, of course, this, our forward 3-inch gun, it can rotate. So we control the horizontal, but we also control the vertical. This is, of course, a dual-purpose 3-inch gun. And hilariously enough, is a relatively early gun in the US Navy, was on its way out thanks to the advent of 5-inch 25 and 5-inch 38 weapons, but then came back a little bit on smaller ships like Slater here, and was then later developed. And so the 3-inch 50 automatic, usually found in a twin mount on later ships, post-World War II ships, is a direct descendant of this weapon as well. So let's have a look at what else we've got up here on the bow of the ship. So, of course, being a destroyer escort, it's not just the guns, it's also the anti-submarine launchers. Now, the first element of the anti-submarine warfare equipment, if the sub has the temerity to stay underwater, obviously if it's on the surface you can shoot it with a 3-inch, is this, the Hedgehog launcher. Now, this is the forward-firing element of the anti-submarine armament, and this is actually a really handy display because most Hedgehog launchers, such as there are out there, I mean there aren't that many on active display, look like this top row here. So you've got the cover, but the rest of them you can actually see how they would fuse and activate. So of course they've got safety pins in there at the moment, but here's your Hedgehog mortar round, and here is your little impeller. So for those of you who are asking in various dry dock questions about how these things are armed, you know, when this thing gets fired, this thing will obviously start to spin up, but this, if you look at the instant angle of the blades, this is really going to start spinning up when it hits the water. So fire this thing up through the air. If it hits something on the surface, not really a lot is going to happen other than, well, you've been hit by a mortar round the size of a small child, but it's probably not going to explode. But as soon as it touches the water, this thing is going to get spun up really fast, fuse is going to activate, and now this thing is get ready to hit. And of course, the whole thing's on a movable launch set. So the angle, the launch angle of each of these rounds is slightly different. The one up forward is quite low, gets slightly higher as you go further back, and the offset relative to each other is going to remain the same, and that means that whenever you fire it, it's going to do a pattern of charges, which increases your chances of hitting the submarine. But you can rotate the whole thing, so you've got 4 rows or 4 columns, I should probably say, of charges here, and each column, as you can see down here, is on a rotating beam, so you can rotate the entire assembly starboard or port, so you don't just fire directly over the bow, you can fire an angle off to port or starboard depending on what your sonar is telling you, which gives you a bit more flexibility. But that is the one disadvantage of Hedgehog. Yes, you can cover a large area, but each of these charges is relatively small. You have to actually score a direct charge to hull contact to actually damage the submarine. If it goes past the sub, even by a foot, it's not going to detonate, and even if it did, a charge this size isn't going to do a huge amount of damage at any great distance from the sub. So these things are perfect in the Second World War, but even by the end of the Second World War, they're looking at what would later become in UK service Squid or Limbo, and in US service various other designations, which would gradually supplant and replace Hedgehog, although it, depending on what ship you were on, would depend on which of those 2 options was selected, because this was still very useful in a short-range ahead throwing configuration. So even if you had some of the larger units which could... So even if you had some of the larger units which could throw the equivalent of a full-size depth charge forward, obviously this still potentially had advantages in terms of overall coverage and speed of reload. So some ships would have the newer technology installed as well as, and some ships would have this taken off and newer technology installed instead of. And the Hedgehog lockers right behind us is where all the spare mortar rounds are stored, because of course once you fire them all off, you've got to reload them all. And yes, for those of you who are wondering, here's the Hedgehog launcher, and here's the back of the forward 3-inch gun. So if you are a 3-inch gun crew here on Mount 3-1 and an enemy submarine is spotted forward, you might be sitting or standing somewhere roughly here, and those things might be firing straight over your head. Just hope you've got some form of ear protection, and especially if you are standing, say, here, well, don't, or be very, very good at ducking. Now, although it's a relatively speaking small and light weapon for naval warfare of the Second World War, the 3-inch gun does have a few advantages. It fires really, really quickly, which is handy. As we mentioned earlier, it is also a dual-purpose weapon, so you can see we've got our anti-aircraft sight up there, as well as the fact we can engage surface targets. And of course, it's very quick and easy to train, even manually. Despite its, relatively speaking, small size and weight, it is still ultimately a larger weapon than a good number of the tanks in the Second World War had, and of course those mounted their guns in turrets and so forth, but still. Now, the camera is sitting on top of one of the ready-use ammunition lockers, And this is another advantage of the 3-inch. So unlike the 5-inch, which you would see on some destroyer escorts and pretty much every US destroyer of World War II, that has 2-part ammunition. So the shell comes separate to the charge, both of which have to be loaded. Now you might have guessed by what I'm leaning on here, with the 3-inch, the ammunition comes as one piece. So you would come over to your ammunition locker, you would flip up your little catch, you would pull out the round, the whole round, and you would bring it over here. Now, why is this unit, now you can see this is the thing, you can actually pick up the whole thing. There's the shell at the top, and this is your brass case containing the charge. Why on earth would you put it in here as opposed to in here? Well, the answer to that is this is a fuse setter, so this will be using the ship's fire control system if you're engaging in an anti-aircraft mode. This will set the timing on a fuse for mechanical fuse so that it'll go a certain distance and then explode, hopefully in the vicinity of the aircraft that you're targeting. You can then take it out because that will be on the nose, and it'll go up into here, at which point this breech block will slide shut and it's all ready to go. So of course, being one piece meant that one man could bring the entire round to the gun and it's done, gone and in and job done, as opposed to bigger guns, which of course 5-inch, 6-inch, 2-part ammunition, and once you get to heavy cruiser or battleship scale weapons, you're talking about a single shell and then multiple charges, and you're also talking about ammunition that's so large and so heavy it has to be moved almost entirely mechanically rather than by hand. Whereas this, nice and man portable, and of course being a small round, you can store quite a few of them in the ready use lockers. So in the ready use locker the camera's on, 4 rounds across, 6 rounds down, so that's immediately 24 rounds, if my math is working correctly, and there's another ready use locker over there, so you've got 48 rounds ready to go before you have to bring a single one up from the magazines. So we've now ascended a level to mount 32 or 32, so this is the Superfiring 3-inch mount, and as you can see this still moves. It's a little stiffer than the one down there, but you know, a 3-inch gun is a 3-inch gun. Now the important thing you need to know about being up here is that while we have another 3-inch gun and we have our little blast plate there, so blast deflector, so that if we do have to fire dead ahead, we're not going to concuss the Hedgehog operators or the guys operating the forward gun. At this level, we also have a couple of other emplacements. So we're just going to hopefully, yeah, that works. So the destroyer escorts, being somewhat larger than corvettes, so in Royal Navy speak this would be a frigate, they could be somewhat more substantially heavily armed for the anti-aircraft role, especially considering that while in the Atlantic, corvettes, frigates, destroyer escorts all are facing pretty much similar AA threats, the destroyer escorts were also designed, obviously being US designs, with the prospect of having to go across the Pacific and deal with the Japanese, and the Japanese air threat to transports, escort carrier groups, invasion convoys, supply convoys, etc., was somewhat more substantial than the German air threat to Atlantic convoys. That's not to say there wasn't a threat to the Atlantic convoys from German aircraft, the Condor and so forth, and if you're going up from Gibraltar via the Bay of Biscay, the Ju-88s and so forth, they were threats, but perhaps not as numerous or as substantial and as regular as Japanese air threats, and hence the US destroyer escorts, especially towards the end of the war, tended to carry an awful lot more weaponry for anti-aircraft use. So not only are those 3-inch guns dual purpose, but there are lots and lots of these. So these are twin 20mm Oerlikons. I'll spin you right round. So you've got your plate there, and then as you can see, we've got our twin barrels there, ammunition drums, and as you can see, the whole thing is relatively easily able to be moved by one person. Of course, it's slightly heavier than a single mount, but you've still got the shock absorbing brackets there. So if I was the gunner, I would be positioning myself somewhat like this. Obviously bag would be off so I could see what I was doing, and I'd be maneuvering it round and opening fire on incoming aircraft. And for now, I'm just going to train that on people coming on the down ramp off the freeway, because I find that amusing. We've got another identical mount just over to the starboard side and more ready use lockers here. So let's continue further aft and obviously also upward. Now we've come one more level up and there is another 20mm twin mounting here. So when you compare that to let's say a Flower class corvette, which if you're lucky on the forward arc will have a single 4-inch and maybe a pair of single 20mm Oerlikons, one either side of the bridge wing. The bridge is actually just behind us here. We're actually on bridge level, but of course, as we saw down there and over down there, we have two twin 20mm Oerlikons plus two single 3-inch 50s, and now we have another twin 20mm Oerlikon. So we have 6 20mm Oerlikon barrels with commanding forward arcs of fire. And in the case of this one, obviously, maybe about a 200-degree arc of fire, as long as you don't mind breaking a few windows from shock. So a lot of forward anti-aircraft firepower, and of course the ship is quite maneuverable. So although, as we'll see, there's plenty of firepower aft, if you want to or need to point the ship towards an aerial threat, which might not be a terrible idea, because depending on the type of attack aircraft you might actually want to do that, you still have a lot of firepower that you can throw at them. Now, the reason I say depending on the type of aircraft, if your threat is a torpedo bomber, you definitely want to turn your ship towards the threat, because obviously a torpedo is going to run, hopefully, roughly straight. If you're running perpendicular to the line of the advance of said torpedo, you can bring the majority of your anti-aircraft firepower to bear on it, but you're also presenting a perfect target for the torpedo. The length of your ship is your greatest dimension, and that's what the torpedo wants to hit. Whereas if you turn your bow towards the torpedo bomber, a drop that might otherwise have been perfectly on target and hit you, 100 feet forward or 100 feet aft of the exact center of the ship, well, if you're bow on, that'll pass down your port or starboard side. Conversely, if you're being attacked by a dive bomber, when that dive bomber releases his bomb, obviously if he releases it slightly early or slightly late, it might go long or short. And at that point, it's a good idea to be broadside on, because if it's very slightly short, bearing in mind your beam is your narrowest dimension, then that bomb will drop short into the water. Okay, you might get a little bit of blast damage, but probably not a huge amount. And similarly, if it goes long over the other side, you're not being directly hit. Whereas if you go head on into a dive bomber, if he drops 50 foot short or 50 foot long, then he's still going to hit the ship lengthwise, as opposed to if he came on broadside. So this is one of the reasons why those recognition manuals are so important. You have to identify what it is you're being attacked by in order to identify what your best approach to defending yourself is, assuming, of course, that you have a completely free hand to defend yourself, which you might not. So, for example, if you're running Escort for a much bigger target, much more valuable target, like an Escort carrier, then you might just have to stay locked into whatever course you're in, roughly speaking, regardless of what kind of threat you're facing. But when you do have a free hand, knowing what aircraft is attacking you is very, very handy. The other thing, of course, is while you might want to do some maneuvering, you don't want to do too violent a set of maneuvers, because the more violent the maneuver you do, the more you're potentially going to be throwing off your gunners. And as far as the aircraft is concerned, what on the ship might seem to be quite radical maneuvers doesn't usually require too much of a correction for the aircraft's course and speed when they're making their drops. Now, very extreme maneuvers, spins, turns, that kind of thing, that can put an aircraft off a little bit more. But especially if you're relying on purely manually aimed guns, you have to make a bargain between, okay, how much of a stable firing platform do I give my gunners versus how much evasive action am I going to try and take against incoming enemy aircraft. But if you're a destroyer escort like Slater here, you've got a lot of anti-aircraft gunnery, so you might want to rely more on that. Now, we're just aft of the forward superstructure here, and we're actually standing next to one of the most important elements of the ship's gunnery. Now, this is not some kind of weird prototype gun or halfway house gun or anything like that. This is a training mount. And if you go on bigger museum ships, battleships and so forth, you'll see versions of this on most of them. This is a This is a 3-inch training mount as opposed to the 5-inch training mounts you'll see on the other ships. Now, the key thing about these trainers is, of course, it allows you to exercise your gun crews how to quickly load and fire their guns without using the actual guns, because, of course, every time you use your actual gun, you're increasing wear and tear on that gun and potentially compromising its accuracy a little bit, but also accelerating the time when it needs to go in for refit, repair, replacing, or reconditioning. Whereas with the 3-inch trainer, just here, you can not only train as much as you like, but you can also afford to make mistakes, which is very important when obviously you're bringing your crew up to spec. So of course you have the simulated bit of the fuse setter here, and then you would take your round, and then your round would go into here, and you'd push it all the way up, and there's a pair of clips in here. When those clips are hit, it releases the breech block springs up, it's already in place, and then there's a lever here, which of course if that does spring up, then you would crank that down to remove the training round, and you would then place it back ready for the next guy. Or if you were practicing speed firing, repeat. So very useful little bit of kit, allows you to get your crew's gunnery skills up to tip-top condition while keeping your guns also in tip-top condition for when you have to face off against the enemy. Right, so as you can probably see, we're now just aft of the funnel, and in this area, as originally fitted, the ship would have carried some torpedoes, because the idea of a destroyer escort was that, yes, as we've said before, she will probably be used in escorting convoys, but one, convoys might be attacked by surface raiders. Two, there was also a view, as it turned out a correct one, that they might be called in to escort fleet units of some description, and that, of course, meant, in both cases, chances of being attacked by surface units. 3-inch guns, good against submarines, not so good against a cruiser or a battleship or a battle cruiser. So torpedoes, at least a few of them, gave a destroyer escort a punch against much larger ships. But as the war went on, and let's just say the numbers of large Japanese ships started to decrease rather rapidly, the prospect of being attacked by said ships decreased quite significantly for the destroyer escorts. But, of course, with kamikazes and so forth, the chances of air attack was still very high, if not even higher, as they got closer and closer to Japan. And so away went the torpedo launchers, and in came more anti-aircraft guns. Now, these are, of course, yet more 20mm Oerlikons. We've seen some of those forward. So again, another twin mount with a gun tub. And you can see we've got a pair here, we've got a pair there. We've obviously got corresponding pairs on the opposite side behind the camera. So just in this little area where you would have had space for a single set of torpedo launchers, we have 4 different anti-aircraft mounts, which grant us another 8 20mm Oerlikons. And it doesn't end there. There's even more that way. But something else that's quite useful to know is, you can see I'm sort of semi-hiding behind this open lid. Now, this is a ready ammunition locker, much like you would see up front for the 3-inch rounds, except this is for the 20mm guns. So we can see behind us our 20mm mounts. You've got those big, nice drums of 20mm shells. Well, what happens when you run out? And let's face it, it's an autocannon. If you're firing on kamikazes coming in, you're probably going to run out fairly quickly. Well, that's where these things come in. Spare drums. So we've got 4 here in this locker on the top level, and then once you've expended those 4, there's a panel, and you flip that up and there'll be another 4. So this locker contains 8 drums, so 4 pairs, because we've got 2 guns. So that's including the pair that's on there, just using this locker and the ones already there. That means you've got 5 sets of drums for the guns, and then of course you've got a locker there, locker there, locker there. So theoretically each locker services 1 set of guns, but of course if you're more heavily engaged on one side than the other, no one's really going to object too much to you taking a few drums from over there to defend the ship over here, because you can always restock those from the clipping room and the ship's magazines later on. And now we're even further aft, and you might recognize from the flared barrels here, yes, this is the good old 40mm Bofors, again in twin mount flavor. So we've got 2 here and 2 here, So we've got 2 here and 2 behind, where the camera's actually sitting on the left-hand seat of the port side Bofors mount. And as you can see, as is pretty much consistent across the board with Slater's guns, these are also operational. So on this case, the right-hand side arm controls our rotation. And if I go behind here, now you can't see me, but you can still hear me. And the port side seat controls the elevation. And of course here, the 40mm rounds are substantially bigger than the 20mm rounds. So where the 20mm rounds come in drums, you can hopefully see there, we've got clips of 40mm ammunition, which are fed in the top here. And for these, their ready use, it is at the gun tubs. So as you can see, each of these, we have 4 40mm rounds, and they could be dropped in, obviously, to each of the 40mm guns. And you've got loads and loads of them here, some over there, whole bunch over there again. So you have a bunch of ready use ammo that you can fire off pretty darn quickly. And then later on, you can bring up spare ammo if the engagement goes on for long enough. Now we've gotten to the aft section of the ship, and we're looking forward, as you can probably tell by the mast. So we have yet another set of 40mm Bofors, so that takes us up to 6 40mm. That's facing directly aft, and much like the 3 sets of twin 20mm up forward, that means that the 3 sets of twin 40mm back here, they can all fire aft, and obviously the aft one has a very wide arc of fire, the other 2 have just over 180-degree arc of fire. But we are standing, and the camera is sitting, on the aft 3-inch mount, so the last of the 3-inch mounts. But we're also, if I bring the camera over here and just drop it down, we're back with the anti-submarine armament as well. So here we have K guns equipping with depth charges. Now, there is a slight difference between a K gun and a Y gun. It's not really that complicated. A K gun, which you can see here, can fire a depth charge off to one side, whereas a Y gun would sit amidships and is essentially 2 K guns welded together and can fire depth charges in both directions. That means that in terms of floor space used, the Y gun is the more efficient design, but of course it takes up a midship space, which on most ships, especially in the Second World War, is taken up by other things like bigger guns, the masts, the funnels, the radars, etc. And so K guns are still very, very prevalent, and in fact far more prevalent than Y guns during the Second World War period. Now, the other thing that's quite interesting that you can see here is 2 different kinds of depth charge. So over here on this second K gun, this is just your big cylinder, or ash can as some people would call them. That is a much more typical depth charge as you might imagine it. However, these things that look like really fat little bombs, these are actually fairly typical US Navy issue depth charges. And as you can tell from the fins and the shaping, these actually sink at a slightly faster rate and a slightly more predictable course, because of course they will sink nose down, fins up, which makes them slightly better weapons to use against submarines. But of course the shaping means that they are slightly more complex to manufacture. But you know, it's the US, so they can produce as many of them as they like. So we've got 2 K-gun launchers here, and then swing aft, and we've got another 2 K-gun launchers here. So that means that on each side, the Slater can fire off 4 depth charges immediately in a pattern, and then of course they can reload. As you can see, each K-gun launcher has its own davit, because these are depth charges, they do weigh a fair bit. You can, in theory, reload them by hand, that's what the handles are for, but it's much easier to use a davit, and it's very exhausting if you have to hand load it all the time. And then as we look further aft, where we're going in a minute, there's yet more 20mm Oerlikons, but also the more traditional depth charges on their depth charge rail. So let's go. And now we find ourselves at the aft end of the ship. So here at the aft end, we have 2 depth charge rails. So if you were attacking a submarine, typically by the time Slater comes into service, you could either try and hold it forward and use your Hedgehog launchers, or you would travel over it and fire a pattern of depth charges. So your K-guns would be firing on either side, and then your depth charge rails here would be rattling depth charges off the stern as well. So these are the more traditional types. They're just big cylinders, and although you can't see, hopefully I'll inlay a photo or something, but over here is your settings. So currently, obviously, understandably, they are set to safe and bolted that way, but when you're setting them for when you want to head out and target enemy vessels, then you would go over and not trip over a cable, you would go over and turn them so you've got different depth settings: 30, 50, 7500, 150, 200, 250, 300, etc. And over they'd go and detonate at that kind of depth, whatever that happened to be. So of course here at the moment we've got a full rail, but then we've got a second rail at the top, so in service you'd have another set of depth charges up there ready to replace these as you expend them. And of course every ship has a listed complement of depth charges, which is what they're supposed to be issued with, but most of the time escort crews would find ways of securing considerably more than that, and they'd just be scattered around the decks ready to reload.
Now, I mentioned something unique that you probably will never see on any other museum ship, and that's what you're about to experience here, because, well, those of you who were there will already know where I'm going with this, but for those of you who weren't, a fairly large number of you showed up to the Slater when I was doing this, and the crew of USS Slater allowed me very kindly to film the ship with a drone, which you can see here, but if you look very closely, what you'll see is that there were actually enough people between the docents and the subscribers to man pretty much every operational anti-aircraft gun, which is pretty much every gun on the ship. 3-inch, 40mm, 20mm, etc. Everything that could move was being moved, which is doubly impressive because it shows also just how well preserved Slater is, and well, how much of a good job Slater's crew have done in restoring her capabilities. So what you're looking here, albeit in somewhat slow motion, considering my drone isn't flying at the speed of a Japanese Zero, is roughly what a pilot would have experienced had they chosen to get a little bit too close to a US destroyer escort in World War II, only with slightly less tracer rounds. But you can actually see just how many of those anti-aircraft guns are tracing in on the drone. So obviously, absolutely huge thank you to the staff and crew of USS Slater, who very kindly, obviously asking them in advance, granted permission for us to do all of this, because it's not every day a museum ship says, yeah, you know what, a whole bunch of you show up, everybody get on the guns and start pointing them at things. And obviously flying the drone was a very fun experience, and luckily, as you can see, the weather was absolutely fantastic for it. But it also gives you an idea of the level of coverage that the layout of Slater's guns actually provide, because as you can see, as we're going from aft to forward, all of those wing mounts on the midship section of the ship are actually still able to bear, even as we pass by the bow of the ship. And you can even see some of the port side mounts even have line of sight, albeit limited. As we go further around close to the bow, you can see the port side mounts are now being masked by the ship's own funnel, but that's actually a fairly steep line of attack to be shot at from the other side of the ship. And then, of course, from up front, we're unmasking all those twin 20mm we looked at fairly early on. Now we're coming back round at a slightly higher speed, so giving everybody a chance to work those cranks to get the guns around really quickly. Now, of course, again, the drone's still not flying anything like the speed of an actual attacker, but that very, very close pass is giving a very high rate of change of bearing, which would be similar to what you might experience from a faster aircraft going past further away. And now we're hovering directly over the ship and going straight up. So you can see there a 3-inch and some of the Bofors cranked all the way up. So not even dive bombing a ship like Slater is necessarily going to work out for you very well, because almost every gun can point at almost 90 degrees straight up. And of course, dive bombers, contrary to some of the movies, are not going to come in straight in at 90 degrees. For one thing, obviously, if you drop a bomb going straight down at 90 degrees and the ship is moving, then assuming that you were aiming for the ship, you would miss because the ship would move on. You have to drop it at a slight angle. But nonetheless, it gives you some idea of the usefulness of having both your dual purpose and dedicated weapons able to crank up to such a high level. So now that Slater's open for her 2025 visitor season, previous to this she was open at weekends, but now I think she's open all week and weekend. Obviously, check the website for exact opening times, etc. You too can go and see this particular ship and maybe even have a little bit of a play around on some of the various ship's weapons that have been preserved. And as you'll notice, there are some signals flying from her foremast as well, so extra bonus points if you pause the video and work out what exactly those signal flags are saying. Now, typically, on most of these museum ship tours that I do, we look at the stuff that you can see on the upper decks, bridge, armament, etc., which is what we've done so far, because the idea is that you get a taste of the ship, but then obviously you try and see the ship as well yourself to experience everything else on board. And there is quite a lot to experience on board, despite the fact that she is, after all, a relatively small warship. But in this particular case, we're also going to take a brief look in the engine room. But before we do that, and before everyone furiously types on keyboards to point out the mistake, I would like to point out the next segment does contain a small mistake by myself. You'll hear me refer to the Slater's propulsion system as a turbo-electric system. This is not strictly the case. It is, in fact, a diesel-electric system. It is like a turbo-electric system in that you have some form of drive. In turbo-electric drive, obviously, that is steam boilers and steam turbines. In this case, it's diesel engines, which rotate a generator to create electricity, which is then put into motors, which is then used to turn the propellers to get you moving, which is a system you do see in some diesel submarines at the time, but in other diesel submarines you would have the batteries turning electrical motors, and you would have a separate clutch system that the diesels could drive the propellers directly. But that's neither here nor there. In any case, the Slater's propulsion system, as I said, is a diesel-electric system. It's like turbo-electric drive, but it is not itself a turbo-electric drive system because it doesn't have any turbines in it. So when I refer to turbo-electric in the following segment, please understand that's a mistake on my part. I should be saying diesel-electric or like turbo-electric.
Well, everyone, we find ourselves down here in compartment B4 of USS Slater, machinery or engine compartment, if you like. Now, there are two main things that distinguish the various classes of US destroyer escort. The more obvious one is the armament, which is above us. Of course, some destroyer escorts had 3-inch guns, some had 5-inch guns. The layouts, configurations, etc. were all slightly different on a class-by-class basis, and of course that evolved during the Second World War. But the other big difference between most of the destroyer escort classes, which is not so visible, is their method of propulsion. Now, the US, even with its gigantic industry in the Second World War, did face something of a problem when it came to mass producing the destroyer escorts. And that was what you might call an industrial throttle. They could build the guns, they could build the hull, they could build all sorts of things en masse. But where there was a throttle was the production of reduction gears for steam turbines, which of course were the standard method of propulsion for warships in the 1930s and 1940s, the standard gear turbine setup. They're very, very precise bits of kit, and there are only a certain number of places that could manufacture them, and those places were running flat out. Now, that's fine if you want to build an Iowa-class battleship or even a lot of Essex-class carriers. Fundamentally, you don't need too many reduction gears for those classes. You're still talking about double-digit numbers, maybe pushing into low triple digits for the Essexes. But when you're building triple-digit numbers of destroyer escorts, that could be a problem. Bear in mind, obviously, you're also building lots of destroyers, cruisers, and everything else. And so they looked at the destroyer escorts, and they realized two things. Firstly, there was no way they could actually build enough reduction gears to put steam turbines in all the destroyer escorts they wanted to build and the rest of the fleet. But secondly, they didn't have to, because a destroyer escort, which was primarily in the initial stages designed for convoy escort work, didn't have to reach 30 plus knots to be a fleet escort, although some of the more swift destroyer escorts did later operate on the front lines, what they needed to be was faster than the convoys they were escorting at a margin sufficient that they could chase down submarines and then return to the convoy without it taking a day to catch up. Now, that meant, of course, that if you don't need the absolute power output of a steam turbine power plant with reduction gears, you can look at alternatives. And they played around with a lot of different alternatives as they went. Pretty much all destroyer escorts were based around the general idea of diesel propulsion, so using diesel engines. Now, if you've seen my video that I did aboard USS Stuart, you'll see she's powered by a whole series of diesels. It's fairly logical. Just pop in the diesels instead of your boilers and steam turbines and job's done. But, as we said, the propulsion system switched around a bit between the different classes, and aboard the Cannon class, which is what USS Slater here is, they used turboelectric drive, but not quite the same turboelectric drive that you'd find in a Lexington-class aircraft carrier. Obviously, in that, it was steam turbine, driving generator, driving motor, driving the screws. But as we just said, if you're not going to put reduction gears into the destroyer escorts, that means you're also not going to be ordering steam turbines for them. The diesels could be built much quicker, much more efficiently, and in much larger numbers. And so this is a diesel turbo-electric drive vessel. So you would have seen earlier, and I might also put somewhere in the screen here, one of the ship's diesel motors. So you have diesel motors further forward, and it will go essentially engine room, machinery room, engine room, machinery room, and hence why B4, the last one, is machinery room. So just forward of us, so to my right, your left, is a bulkhead which will go through to where one of the diesel motors is. And then here, to my right, is the generator. So all the kinetic energy in form of rotational energy that a diesel engine is producing is coming through into this generator, which is then turning it into lots and lots and lots of electricity. And just before anyone says, well, isn't this a diesel engine as well? Well, yes, this is a diesel, but it's smaller than I am height-wise. This is not a main drive diesel. This is an emergency diesel generator. So if something goes horribly wrong with main propulsion, this can kick in, or someone can come and manually start it, but this is a backup, an emergency unit, which is also why it's in a different compartment to the main diesel generator. Now, what happens once you've got a ton of electricity? Well, turboelectric drive, you need to drive a motor. Well, let's go 3 yards this way. And this is the front end of one of the motors of this vessel. So the electricity has to travel from just over there into here, nice big electric motor set, and then that drives the screws. Now, of course, you'll hopefully all know the advantages and disadvantages of turboelectric propulsion. When it comes to hunting submarines, there are quite a few additional advantages as compared to just normal fleet work, one of which is obviously the ability to very rapidly vary your speed and drop in reverse, which if you're conducting Hedgehog attacks or depth charge attacks on a submarine that's either very close to you or possibly traveling beneath you is obviously extremely handy. But of course also it means that you can run your engine at pretty much a standard output, so your diesel motors, and then you vary the speed of your props via the motor here. Now, why is that an advantage when hunting subs? Well, bearing in mind, German submarines have hydrophones that are pretty sensitive. So if you have a steam-powered vessel and it needs to accelerate, so it's building up its fires, it's increasing pressure, turbines spinning up, etc., there's going to be a little bit of lag there, but also there will be transmitted noise. Now, you might not always be able to hear that transmitted noise if you're far away or very deep or the weather is being really nasty, but in certain circumstances, you might be able to tell what the ship is doing before it actually starts doing it if you're listening hard enough. With turboelectric drive, pretty much the first thing you're going to hear is an increase or decrease in propeller speed, at which point the change that that ship has enacted is probably already happening or about to happen, which gives you a much shorter reaction time. So that's an advantage as well. The disadvantage, of course, of turboelectric drive for a ship of this size is that, well, in something like Stuart, this would just contain another diesel motor, whereas obviously here, as we saw, we've got our generator here and then our motor over here. So there's a little bit less redundancy in terms of numbers, but like any good turboelectric drive ship, although you've got fewer diesel engines, period, you can still, to a certain extent, run the whole ship off of them, including both props, because, of course, you can divert electricity from one to the other as long as one of those motors is running. And that brings us to the end of this tour of USS Slater. Hope you've enjoyed it, and obviously come down and visit the ship in Albany. Check the website for their opening times and days and seasons, because obviously we are in New York State, unfortunately not New York City, and it's absolutely definitely worth a visit. One of the best preserved museum ships I've ever been on. But of course, you can't sign off visiting a ship, a museum ship, without ringing the ship's bell if it's operational, and this one definitely is. So, see you again in another video. Just as well I didn't need the hearing of that ear.
And there you have it, folks. My visit to USS Slater. Many thanks to all you subscribers for coming out to man those guns. They're still on here, as you can see, as the drone pulls away. And definitely worth a visit. Maybe let them know that Drax sent you, if you fancy. And, well, see you again in another video, somewhere and sometime fairly soon, with any luck.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.